I told my future mother-in-law that we'd be having our wedding ceremony in my parents' backyard with a budget of $2,800. She looked at me like I'd just announced we were getting married at a gas station. Her perfectly manicured hand flew to her pearl necklace as she let out this sharp, incredulous laugh that echoed through the marble foyer of their Westwood Hills mansion. What Patricia Henderson didn't know was that my college roommate, the quiet guy who used to study political science textbooks until 3 in the morning, had just been sworn in as the youngest governor in Ohio's history, and he was about to be my best man. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'm Jessica Parker, and until 6 months ago I was just another third-grade teacher at Springdale Elementary, living in a modest 2-bedroom apartment and driving a Honda Civic with a dent in the passenger door that I'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. My fiancé Mike Henderson was a firefighter at Station 3, the kind of man who ran into burning buildings without a second thought but turned red as a tomato whenever his mother started talking about country club memberships and investment portfolios. We met at a community barbecue where he was volunteering with the fire safety booth and I was running the face painting table for the kids. There was something refreshingly genuine about him, something that made me forget all about the guys who measured their worth by their car payments and corner office views. Mike's family, however, lived in a completely different universe. The Henderson estate sat behind iron gates in the most exclusive neighborhood in our county, where the driveways were longer than some city blocks and the landscaping budgets exceeded most people's annual salaries. Patricia Henderson had built a real estate empire from the ground up, and her husband Robert managed investment portfolios for half the wealthy families in central Ohio. Their daughter Stephanie had married a corporate lawyer in a wedding that was featured in 3 different magazines, complete with a destination ceremony in Tuscany that cost more than most people's houses. When Mike first brought me home to meet his parents, I wore my best dress and practiced conversation topics in the car. Patricia greeted me with the kind of smile that doesn't reach your eyes and immediately began asking questions about my family's background, my career prospects, and whether I had any plans to pursue something more ambitious than elementary education. The subtext was clear: I wasn't what they'd envisioned for their son. The tension reached its peak during our engagement party at the Grandview Country Club. The venue was Patricia's choice, naturally. A sprawling ballroom with crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the golf course. I felt like I was playing dress-up in someone else's life, surrounded by people who discussed their vacation homes and charity galas with the casual ease of others talking about the weather. When Mike announced our engagement plans, I could see the barely concealed horror in his mother's eyes. We had decided to keep things simple and meaningful. My parents' backyard had been the backdrop for every important moment of my childhood. It was where I'd learned to ride a bike, where we'd had countless family barbecues, where my dad had built me a swing that still hung from the massive oak tree that had stood there for over 50 years. The idea of getting married anywhere else felt artificial, like putting on a costume that didn't fit. But when I explained our vision to Patricia, describing the string lights we'd hang between the trees and the wildflower bouquets my mother and I would arrange ourselves, she physically recoiled. The dining room fell silent as she processed what I'd just told her. Even the catering staff seemed to pause in their movements, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Her laugh started as a small chuckle, then grew into something louder and more pointed. She turned to her husband with wide eyes, as if seeking confirmation that she'd heard correctly. Robert Henderson set down his crystal wine glass with the kind of deliberate movement that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. "Jessica, dear," Patricia said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension usually reserved for children who've suggested something particularly naive. "Surely you're not serious about this backyard idea." Mike's sister had her wedding at a villa in Tuscany. The photographs were simply stunning. I still have the magazine features framed in my office. I felt my cheeks burn, but I kept my voice steady. "We've thought about it a lot, and we really want something intimate and personal. My parents have put a lot of love into their garden, and it means so much to us. But what will people think?" Stephanie chimed in from across the table, setting down her champagne flute with enough force to make it ring against the tablecloth. I mean a backyard wedding with a $3,000 budget. That's not even enough for decent flowers, let alone catering. It sounds more like a neighborhood barbecue than an actual wedding. The room erupted in murmurs of agreement from the assembled family members and friends. I heard someone whisper something about setting expectations and another voice mentioning family reputation. Mike's hand found mine under the table, his palm damp with perspiration as he squeezed my fingers in what I hoped was solidarity rather than apology. 2,800, I corrected quietly, though I immediately regretted drawing more attention to the number. Even worse, Patricia said with another one of those laughs that felt like ice water in my veins. Honey, I spend more than that on my monthly hair appointments. This isn't about money, it's about respect. Respect for the institution of marriage, respect for our family name, respect for the guests who'll be expected to attend this event. I wanted to point out that our guest list consisted of people who cared more about celebrating our love than critiquing our floral arrangements, but I bit my tongue. These were going to be my in-laws, and despite their obvious disapproval, I was determined to find a way to bridge the gap between our worlds. Perhaps we could help, Robert suggested, leaning forward with the kind of expression usually reserved for business negotiations. There's a lovely venue at the country club, and I'm sure we could arrange something more appropriate, something that reflects well on everyone involved. Mike finally spoke up, his voice hoarse with tension. We appreciate the offer, Dad, but Jess and I have already made our decision. We want something that feels like us. Well, that's exactly the problem, Stephanie muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. The silence that followed was deafening. I excused myself to the powder room, where I spent 10 minutes staring at my reflection in the gold-framed mirror, wondering how I'd ended up in a situation where my dream wedding had become a source of family embarrassment. When I returned to the table, the conversation had moved on to safer topics like golf tournaments and stock portfolios, but I could feel the undercurrent of disapproval that would follow us through the rest of our engagement. Over the following weeks, Patricia made several more attempts to change our minds. She left brochures for expensive venues on Mike's kitchen counter and sent me links to wedding planners whose services started at $20,000. She even offered to pay for everything herself, as long as we agreed to something more dignified than a backyard ceremony. Each conversation chipped away at my confidence a little more. I started second-guessing details that had once seemed perfect. Maybe string lights were too casual. Maybe we should have hired a proper caterer instead of asking family members to contribute their favorite dishes. Maybe I was being selfish, insisting on something so far out.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Outside their expectations, Mike sensed my growing uncertainty and tried his best to reassure me, but I could see the strain in his eyes too. He was caught between the woman he loved and the family that had raised him, trying to honor both without disappointing either. It was an impossible position, and I hated that my simple desire for an authentic celebration had put him there. The breaking point came 3 weeks before the wedding, during what was supposed to be a casual dinner at the Henderson house. Patricia had invited several family friends, ostensibly to meet me, but it quickly became apparent that the evening was designed as another intervention attempt. As we sat around their mahogany dining table, eating a meal prepared by their private chef, the conversation inevitably turned to wedding plans. One of Patricia's friends, a woman named Caroline who wore diamonds like some people wear watches, asked about our venue with the kind of curiosity usually reserved for examining specimens under a microscope. "Oh, they're having it in Jessica's parents' backyard," Patricia announced, her tone suggesting she was describing a natural disaster. "It's very rustic." Caroline's eyebrows shot up toward her carefully styled hairline. "How charming, like a barn wedding, but more residential. We think it'll be beautiful," I said, trying to inject some enthusiasm into my voice despite the growing knot in my stomach. "I'm sure it will be very sweet," another guest added with the kind of smile people use when they're trying to be polite about something they find distasteful. "Very authentic." The word authentic hung in the air like an accusation, as if choosing sincerity over spectacle was somehow a character flaw. I felt my resolve crumbling as they continued to discuss our wedding plans with the barely concealed horror usually reserved for natural disasters or tax audits. That night, as Mike drove me home, I finally broke down. "Maybe your mother is right," I said, staring out the passenger window at the passing streetlights. "Maybe we are being foolish. Maybe we should just have the wedding at the country club and be done with it." Mike pulled over into an empty parking lot and turned to face me. "Jess, this isn't about them. This is about us. About what makes us happy. Since when do we need anyone else's permission to celebrate our love the way we want to? Since your family made it clear that our way isn't good enough," I replied, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "Their opinion doesn't change who we are, or what we mean to each other," he said, reaching for my hand. "Besides, there's something you don't know about our wedding day. Something that might change your perspective on all of this." I looked at him curiously, wondering what kind of surprise he could possibly have planned that would make his family's disapproval any easier to bear, but Mike just smiled mysteriously and promised to explain everything soon. What neither of us knew was that the explanation would come in the form of a phone call that would change everything we thought we knew about our simple backyard wedding. A call from someone whose presence would transform our intimate celebration into something that even Patricia Henderson couldn't dismiss or diminish. The call came on a Tuesday evening while I was grading spelling tests at my kitchen table. My phone buzzed with a number I recognized immediately, even though I hadn't seen it in months. Dave Williams had been my roommate during our freshman year at Ohio State, a quiet political science major who spent most of his time buried in textbooks and policy papers while I struggled through my education courses. We'd stayed in touch sporadically after graduation, exchanging Christmas cards and the occasional social media comment, but our lives had taken such different paths that meaningful contact had become increasingly rare. I almost didn't answer. After a long day of dealing with third graders and an evening of wedding-related anxiety, the last thing I needed was a lengthy catch-up conversation with an old friend. But something made me swipe to accept the call, perhaps the same instinct that had made me trust Dave's advice during our study sessions all those years ago. "Jess Parker," came his familiar voice, though it carried a weight and authority that I didn't remember from our college days. "Please tell me you're not planning to get married without inviting your old roommate." I laughed despite my mood. "Dave Williams, as I live and breathe. How did you even know I was engaged?" "Your mother posted about it on Facebook, with approximately 47 photos and enough exclamation points to power a small city." That sounded exactly like my mother, who had discovered social media with the enthusiasm of an archaeologist uncovering buried treasure. "Well, you're certainly invited, but I should warn you that it's not exactly going to be a fancy affair. We're having it in my parents' backyard with a potluck reception and folding chairs borrowed from the church." There was a pause on the other end of the line, long enough that I wondered if we'd lost connection. When Dave spoke again, his voice carried a warmth that reminded me why we'd become such good friends despite our different majors and career aspirations. "Jess, that sounds absolutely perfect. Exactly the kind of wedding I'd expect from you. Genuine, welcoming, focused on what actually matters." "Well, not everyone shares that opinion," I said, unable to keep the frustration out of my voice. "Let me guess, future in-laws with strong opinions about how things should be done." "How did you know?" "Lucky guess. Listen, I know this might sound presumptuous, but would you consider letting me be part of the ceremony? As a groomsman, or even just someone who gives a toast, I'd really love to celebrate this moment with you." I was touched by the offer, but also confused by the timing. "Dave, that's incredibly sweet, but aren't you a little busy these days? I mean, last I heard you were working in Columbus on some political campaign." Another pause, this one accompanied by what sounded like a chuckle. "Jess, exactly how closely have you been following Ohio politics lately?" "Not very closely, I admit. Between teaching and wedding planning, I've barely had time to keep up with current events." "Why? I think you might want to Google my name when we hang up." Something in his tone made my stomach flutter with curiosity and anticipation. "Dave, what aren't you telling me?" "Let's just say that my schedule is flexible enough to accommodate a backyard wedding in Springdale. And Jess, I have a feeling your future in-laws might find our celebration more memorable than they're expecting." After we hung up, I immediately opened my laptop and typed David Williams, Ohio into the search bar. The results that populated made me blink several times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Headlines about the youngest governor in state history, articles about his grassroots campaign and progressive agenda, photographs of him being sworn in just 6 months earlier. The quiet, studious boy who used to help me with my statistics homework was now one of the most powerful political figures in our state. I called Mike immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed his number. "You're not going to believe this," I said as soon as he answered. "Try me. Remember how I told you about my college roommate Dave? The one who was always studying political science, the one you said was really smart but kind of shy. He's the governor of Ohio." The silence on Mike's end lasted so long that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "The governor, as in the actual governor, as in the guy we see on the news, the very same, and he wants to be part of our wedding." "Jess, are you absolutely sure about this? I mean, how do you even know it's really him?" I spent the next 20 minutes walking Mike through everything I'd found online, from campaign photos where I could clearly see my old roommate's familiar smile to recent news articles about his policy initiatives. There was no doubt about it, David Williams, the boy who used to fall asleep over constitutional law textbooks, was now Governor David Williams, the man whose approval ratings had been making national headlines. "So what do we do?" Mike asked, his voice a mixture of excitement and terror. "We invite him to our backyard wedding and let him eat potato salad off paper plates like everyone else. And we don't tell my parents." I thought about Patricia's reaction to our modest budget and simple venue, then imagined her expression when she realized that the governor of Ohio was attending our embarrassing backyard ceremony. "We don't tell anyone," I said firmly. "Let them discover it for themselves." The next morning, I called Dave back and officially invited him to be Mike's best man, a role that felt perfectly natural despite the unusual circumstances. He accepted immediately and promised to keep his attendance quiet until the day of the wedding. We discussed logistics briefly, security considerations, parking arrangements, the need for discretion, but mostly we just laughed about how surreal the situation had become. "You know," Dave said as our conversation wound down, "this is exactly the kind of wedding I've been hoping to attend. Something real, something that isn't about political networking or photo opportunities. Just friends celebrating love. Even if it means eating off paper plates, especially if it means eating off paper plates." As I hung up the phone, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. For weeks, I'd been allowing other people's opinions to chip away at my confidence in our decisions. But Dave's enthusiasm reminded me that our wedding wasn't about impressing anyone or meeting arbitrary standards of sophistication. It was about celebrating our love with the people who truly mattered to us. The irony wasn't lost on me that the validation I needed had come from someone whose opinion could literally influence state policy, while the people whose approval I'd been desperately seeking measured worth primarily in dollars spent and social status achieved. It was a reminder that true respect and genuine affection couldn't be bought or borrowed, they had to be earned through authenticity and consistency. Over the next 2 weeks, I threw myself into wedding preparations with renewed enthusiasm. Mike and I spent evenings stringing lights between the trees in my parents' backyard, testing different arrangements until we found the perfect pattern. My mother and I visited every flower shop in a 20-mile radius, selecting wildflowers and garden roses that would create the effortless natural look we'd envisioned. The guest list remained small and intimate, filled with people who had been part of our journey long before we'd ever heard of country clubs or investment portfolios. My third-grade colleagues promised to help with setup and cleanup. Mike's fellow firefighters volunteered to handle parking and any logistical challenges that might arise. My cousin agreed to photograph the ceremony with her professional camera, and Mike's college friend who played guitar in a local band offered to provide music for both the ceremony and reception. Every detail felt intentional and personal, from the mason jar centerpieces that my mother and I assembled during weekend craft sessions to the handwritten menu cards that described each potluck dish and its contributor. We were creating something that reflected our values and personalities, something that would feel meaningful and memorable for all the right reasons. Patricia made a few more attempts to change our minds, each one more desperate than the last. She offered to hire a professional wedding planner who could work within our budget constraints. She suggested postponing the wedding until we could properly plan something appropriate. She even hinted that she might not attend if we insisted on proceeding with our current arrangements, a threat that probably carried more weight in her mind than it did in ours. Mike handled these conversations with increasing confidence, calmly but firmly reiterating our commitment to the wedding we'd planned. I could see him growing stronger with each exchange, learning to prioritize his own values over his family's expectations. It was beautiful to watch, even though I knew it came at the cost of some family harmony. 3 days before the wedding, as I sat in my classroom after school hours, putting the finishing touches on centerpieces with the help of a few dedicated colleagues, I realized that I was genuinely excited about our celebration for the first time in months. Not nervous, not apologetic, not defensive, just purely simply excited to marry the man I loved in a place that felt like home, surrounded by people who cared more about our happiness than our budget allocation. The weather forecast predicted perfect conditions, sunny skies, low humidity and temperatures in the mid-70s. My dress hung in my childhood bedroom closet, a simple but elegant design that I'd found at a local boutique for under $300. Mike's suit had been tailored by his grandfather's old tailor, a man who still operated out of a small shop downtown, and who had refused payment because he remembered Mike as a little boy. Everything was falling into place exactly as we'd hoped. But the best part, the detail that made me smile every time I thought about it, was still our secret. In less than 72 hours, Patricia Henderson was going to discover that her son's embarrassing backyard wedding would be attended by the governor of Ohio, who would stand beside Mike as his best man, and deliver a toast that no country club reception could ever match. I couldn't wait to see her face when Dave took the microphone. The morning of our wedding arrived with the kind of perfect weather that makes you believe the universe is conspiring in your favor. Sunlight streamed through my childhood bedroom windows, casting golden rectangles across the hardwood floor where my wedding dress hung from the antique armoire my grandmother had left me. The house hummed with quiet activity as my mother prepared coffee in the kitchen below, and my father tested the sound system we'd borrowed from the church for the third time since sunrise. I stretched in my twin bed, the same one I'd slept in through high school and college breaks, and felt a sense of peaceful certainty that had been absent for months. Today I would marry Mike Henderson in the backyard, where I'd taken my first steps, learned to garden with my grandmother and spent countless summer evenings catching fireflies with my younger brother Kevin. No amount of disapproval from his family could diminish the rightness of that decision. My phone buzzed with a text from Dave, sent from what I assumed was a secure government device given the formal tone. Security team will arrive at noon for preliminary sweep. They'll be discreet. Looking forward to celebrating with you today. The reality of having the governor at our wedding still felt surreal, but it had stopped feeling overwhelming. Dave was my friend first, and everything else was just circumstance. Rachel Martinez, my maid of honor and fellow third-grade teacher, arrived at 8:30 with a bag full of hair supplies and enough nervous energy to power the entire ceremony. She'd been my closest friend since my first day at Springdale Elementary, when she'd rescued me from a particularly challenging parent conference and introduced me to the informal network of teachers who actually kept the school running. "I still can't believe you're not telling Mike's family about the governor," she said as she began sectioning my hair for the simple updo we'd practiced twice. "Patricia Henderson is going to have a complete meltdown when she realizes what's happening." "That's not why we're doing this," I replied, though I couldn't completely suppress my smile. "We're doing this because Dave is our friend and we want him there. Everything else is just bonus entertainment." Still, Rachel continued, working bobby pins through my hair with practiced efficiency, "It's going to be the most satisfying moment in wedding history." I might actually have to record her reaction for posterity. My mother appeared in the doorway carrying a breakfast tray laden with fresh fruit, homemade muffins and the special blend coffee she'd been saving for important occasions. Linda Parker had been a labor and delivery nurse for 25 years, and she approached every significant event with the calm competence of someone who'd helped bring hundreds of babies into the world. Nothing rattled her, not even the prospect of hosting a wedding in our backyard, while the governor's security team conducted their mysterious preparations. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" she asked, setting the tray on my dresser and perching on the edge of my bed. "Any last-minute nerves?" "Surprisingly, no," I said honestly. "I keep waiting for the anxiety to hit, but I just feel ready. Like everything is exactly as it should be." "That's exactly how I felt on my wedding day," she said, smoothing the quilt my grandmother had made for my 16th birthday. "Your father and I got married in the fellowship hall at our church with a reception in his parents' basement. His mother spent the entire morning complaining about the decorations and the food, but the moment I saw him waiting for me at the altar, none of that mattered anymore. It struck me that my mother understood exactly what I was experiencing, perhaps better than I'd realized. She'd navigated her own version of family expectations and social pressures, choosing love and authenticity over appearance and approval. The pattern was repeating itself a generation later, but with the added twist of a political figure whose presence would shift the entire dynamic in ways Patricia Henderson couldn't possibly anticipate. By 10 o'clock, the transformation of our backyard had begun in earnest. My father and Kevin worked with Mike's friend Chris to arrange the borrowed chairs in neat rows facing the oak tree where we decided to exchange vows. The string lights we'd hung earlier in the week looked magical even in broad daylight, creating a canopy of warm light that would be even more beautiful as evening approached. My mother's flowers, arranged in mason jars and vintage vases collected from estate sales and thrift stores, created centerpieces that were both elegant and unpretentious. The caterers arrived promptly at 10:30, though calling them caterers was generous since they were actually my neighbor Mrs. Patterson and her daughter Amy, who ran a small catering business out of their home kitchen. They'd prepared simple but delicious food that complemented our casual atmosphere: grilled chicken, garden salads, fresh bread, and a selection of desserts that included my grandmother's famous lemon bars alongside a modest two-tier cake from the local bakery. Mike appeared through the back gate at 11, looking handsome and slightly overwhelmed in his navy suit. He'd spent the night at Chris's apartment to preserve the tradition of not seeing the bride before the ceremony, but we'd agreed that he should be present for the final setup and any last-minute coordination that might be needed. "Everything looks incredible," he said, surveying the transformed space with obvious pride. "I know we made the right choice." "Even if your family doesn't agree?" I asked, though I was teasing rather than genuinely worried. "Especially because my family doesn't agree," he replied
Firmly. "This is us, Jess. This is who we are and what we value." I'm tired of apologizing for that. The confidence in his voice was new, a development I'd watched emerge over the past few weeks as he'd learned to prioritize our relationship over his family's expectations. It had required some difficult conversations and uncomfortable moments, but Mike had finally found his footing in the space between his upbringing and his values. At 11:45, two unmarked black vehicles pulled up to the curb in front of our house. The security team emerged with the kind of professional discretion that made their presence obvious only to those who knew what to look for. They wore dark suits and earpieces, but carried themselves with the casual authority of people who could blend into any environment while maintaining constant vigilance. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and an efficient manner, introduced herself to my parents and quickly coordinated with the existing setup to ensure minimal disruption to our plans. Within minutes, they'd identified optimal positioning for their team and established communication protocols that would allow the ceremony to proceed naturally while maintaining appropriate security measures. "Governor Williams should arrive around 1:15, she informed us quietly. "He'll come through the back gate to avoid drawing attention from the street. We appreciate your cooperation in keeping his attendance confidential until he's ready to be introduced." The first guests began arriving at 12:30, and I watched from my bedroom window as friends and family members filled our backyard with warmth and laughter.
My teaching colleagues clustered near the refreshment table, sharing stories and catching up on summer plans. Mike's firefighter friends stood in a loose circle near the sound equipment, their easy camaraderie a sharp contrast to the formal gatherings I'd attended with his extended family. My grandparents arrived in my grandfather's pristine 1987 Buick, moving slowly but with obvious excitement. Grandpa Joe had worn his best suit, the same one he'd been married in 60 years earlier, and Grandma Rose carried a small bouquet of flowers from her own garden as a contribution to our decorations. They represented the kind of enduring love and commitment that had nothing to do with venue costs or social status, everything to do with daily choices and mutual respect. At exactly 1 o'clock, the Henderson family caravan arrived. 3 luxury vehicles pulled up to our modest street with the kind of conspicuous wealth that immediately drew attention from neighbors who were working in their yards or walking their dogs. Patricia emerged from the lead car wearing a designer dress and the expression of someone attending a funeral rather than a wedding. Robert followed in a suit that probably cost more than our entire catering budget, checking his phone with the distracted air of someone hoping to be called away on urgent business. Stephanie and her husband arrived in their own vehicle, having driven separately to maintain their ability to leave early if the celebration proved too painful to endure. She wore sunglasses despite the fact that we were having an outdoor ceremony, and she surveyed our decorations with the kind of critical assessment usually reserved for health department inspections. I watched from my window as they navigated our backyard setup, clearly struggling to find their footing in an environment so different from their usual social circles. Patricia examined the mason jar centerpieces with barely concealed horror, while Robert struck up a stilted conversation with my father about lawn maintenance techniques. The cultural divide between our families had never been more apparent, but it no longer felt like something I needed to bridge or apologize for. "They look like they're attending a wake," Rachel observed, peering over my shoulder at the scene below. "They'll survive," I replied, turning away from the window to focus on final preparations. Besides, the afternoon is about to get much more interesting. At 1:10, my phone buzzed with a message from Dave, "Arriving in 5 minutes. Hope you're ready for this." I wasn't sure anyone could be truly ready for what was about to happen, but I felt a surge of anticipation rather than anxiety. Dave's presence would certainly shift the dynamic of our celebration, but it would also serve as a powerful reminder that respect and recognition came in many forms, most of which had nothing to do with financial resources or social positioning. Rachel helped me into my dress, a simple but elegant design with delicate lace details and a flowing skirt that moved beautifully in the gentle breeze. It had cost less than Patricia probably spent on handbags, but it made me feel radiant and confident. My grandmother's pearl necklace provided the perfect finishing touch, connecting me to generations of women who had chosen love over convenience and authenticity over appearance. At 1:15 exactly, a modest sedan pulled up to the back gate, its government plates visible only to those who were looking for them. Dave emerged wearing a classic dark suit, and the same warm smile I remembered from our college study sessions, though he carried himself with the quiet authority that came with his current position. The security team moved efficiently to establish their perimeter while maintaining the illusion of a casual gathering. I watched through the kitchen window as Dave surveyed our backyard setup with obvious approval, taking in the string lights, wildflower arrangements, and intimate seating arrangement with the genuine appreciation of someone who understood the difference between meaningful and expensive. He exchanged greetings with my parents, who had met him briefly during our college years, and I could see my mother's delighted surprise as she realized exactly who our mystery guest had become. The moment I'd been anticipating finally arrived when Dave approached the area where Mike's family had clustered near the refreshment table. From my vantage point in the kitchen, I could see Patricia's expression change from polite disinterest to confused recognition to complete shock, as she realized that the casually dressed man joining their conversation was Governor David Williams. Her champagne flute paused midway to her lips as the recognition dawned, and I watched Robert's phone slip from his suddenly nerveless fingers. Stephanie's sunglasses slid down her nose as she stared in open amazement at the man who had just introduced himself with characteristic humility and warmth.
"I'm Dave Williams," he said simply, extending his hand to Patricia with the same genuine friendliness he'd shown to every other guest. "I'm here as Jessica's friend and Mike's best man. Thank you for welcoming me to your family celebration." The silence that followed was profound enough to cut through the general buzz of conversation surrounding them. I could practically see Patricia's mind racing as she tried to process the implications of what she'd just learned. The embarrassing backyard wedding she'd been dreading was suddenly being attended by one of the most powerful political figures in the state, who was serving as best man and treating the entire occasion with obvious respect and enthusiasm. "Governor Williams," she managed finally, her voice pitched higher than usual with shock and sudden nervousness. "I had no idea you would be attending. Jessica never mentioned that she knew you personally." "We were roommates in college," Dave replied easily, accepting a glass of lemonade from Amy Patterson and chatting with her briefly about the beautiful job she'd done with the food presentation. "Some friendships transcend politics and protocol. This is exactly the kind of celebration I was hoping to be part of." I could see Robert struggling to process this information, clearly trying to reconcile his assumptions about appropriate wedding venues with the reality of the governor's obvious comfort and approval. Stephanie had removed her sunglasses entirely and was staring at Dave with the kind of fascination usually reserved for exotic animals or natural phenomena. The transformation in their behavior was immediate and complete. Patricia, who had spent months criticizing our choices and questioning our judgment, suddenly began pointing out the charming details of our setup to anyone within earshot. The string lights that had been too casual were now enchantingly rustic. The wildflower arrangements she'd deemed unprofessional were suddenly refreshingly natural and authentic. Robert, meanwhile, had abandoned his phone entirely in favor of positioning himself within Dave's conversational circle, clearly hoping to engage in the kind of political networking that had been impossible when he'd assumed our wedding would be attended exclusively by teachers and firefighters. His entire demeanor shifted from barely concealed boredom to active engagement as he realized the social and professional opportunities that Dave's presence represented. The irony was so perfect it felt scripted. The same people who had questioned our judgment and criticized our choices were now falling over themselves to demonstrate their appreciation for exactly the same decisions they'd been condemning for months. The venue hadn't changed, the budget hadn't increased, and the decorations were identical to what they'd been mocking just hours earlier, but the presence of someone they perceived as important had transformed their entire perspective. From my position at the kitchen window, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. Vindication because their behavior proved everything I'd suspected about their values and priorities, but sadness because it highlighted the conditional nature of their respect and approval. They weren't suddenly appreciating our choices because they'd gained a deeper understanding of what mattered to us. They were changing their tune because someone they considered significant had validated our decisions. Dave, to his credit, seemed completely oblivious to the social maneuvering happening around him. He moved through our gathering with genuine warmth and interest, chatting with my teaching colleagues about education policy, discussing community safety initiatives with Mike's firefighter friends, and complimenting my grandmother on her flower arrangements with obvious sincerity. He treated every guest with the same respect and attention, regardless of their profession or social status. At 1:30, it was time for me to make my entrance. Rachel performed a final check of my hair and makeup, while my father waited outside my bedroom door in his best suit, looking nervous and proud in equal measure. Tom Parker was a man of few words who expressed his emotions through actions rather than speeches, but the tears in his eyes when he saw me in my wedding dress spoke volumes about his feelings. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," he said quietly, offering me his arm with the solemnity of someone who understood the significance of the moment. "Are you ready for this?" "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," I replied honestly. As we stepped out onto the back porch, the assembled guests rose to their feet and turned to face us. The sight of our friends and family gathered in the space where I'd spent my childhood, surrounded by the decorations we'd created with our own hands, filled me with a joy so profound it took my breath away. This was exactly what we'd envisioned: intimate, personal, and focused on the relationships that truly mattered. Mike stood beneath the oak tree with Dave beside him, both men wearing expressions of such happiness and pride that I felt tears spring to my eyes. The contrast between them was striking, not just in their professional achievements, but in their shared commitment to the values that had brought us all together. Mike, the firefighter who ran toward danger to protect others, and Dave, the politician who had built his career on grassroots organizing and community service, represented different paths toward the same fundamental goal of making the world a better place. As my father and I began our walk down the simple aisle created by the borrowed chairs, I caught sight of Patricia's face and felt a surge of satisfaction that I tried not to enjoy too much. Her expression had transformed from resigned disapproval to something approaching awe as she watched me approach the man who would soon become her son-in-law, officiated by a friend whose presence elevated our celebration in ways she was still struggling to comprehend. The ceremony itself was everything we'd hoped it would be: heartfelt, personal, and meaningful. Our officiant, Pastor Williams from the local Methodist church, spoke about love as a choice rather than a feeling, about the importance of building relationships on shared values rather than shared circumstances. His words resonated through our gathering with particular power given the family dynamics that had shaped our engagement experience. When it came time for Dave to present the rings, he stepped forward with a brief but moving speech about friendship, loyalty, and the courage to choose authenticity over expectation. His words were clearly directed at Mike and me, but they carried broader implications that weren't lost on our assembled guests, particularly those who had spent recent months questioning our choices. True partnership, Dave said, his voice carrying easily across our intimate gathering, requires the courage to support each other's authentic selves, even when those selves don't conform to other people's expectations. Mike and Jessica have demonstrated that courage throughout their relationship, and especially in planning this celebration. They've chosen to honor their values and their love rather than external pressures, and that choice reflects the strength of character that will sustain their marriage through whatever challenges they may face. The words hit their mark with surgical precision, particularly among the Henderson family members who had spent months representing those external pressures Dave had referenced. I saw Patricia shift uncomfortably in her chair as she recognized her own behavior reflected in his gentle but pointed observations. As Mike and I exchanged vows beneath the tree where I'd spent countless childhood hours, I felt the rightness of our decision settle into my bones like a physical sensation. This was exactly where we were supposed to be, surrounded by exactly the people who mattered most, celebrating our love in exactly the way that reflected our values and priorities. The moment Pastor Williams pronounced us husband and wife, our gathering erupted in applause and cheers that echoed through the neighborhood, and probably reached the ears of every person within a 3-block radius. Mike's kiss was sweet and confident, and when we turned to face our guests as Miss and Mrs. Henderson, I felt like I was seeing our community through new eyes. The receiving line that formed naturally as guests came forward to offer congratulations was a study in contrasts. My teaching colleagues hugged us with genuine warmth and excitement, sharing stories about their own wedding experiences, and offering advice about marriage with the easy familiarity of people who had known us for years. Mike's firefighter friends clapped him on the back and teased him about being too nervous during the ceremony, their affection obvious despite their joking. But it was the Henderson family's behavior that provided the afternoon's most revealing moments. Patricia approached with the kind of effusive enthusiasm usually reserved for award ceremonies or political fundraisers, gushing about the absolutely perfect ceremony and the incredibly meaningful venue choice. Her transformation was so complete that I almost didn't recognize the woman who had spent months trying to convince us to change our plans. "Jessica, darling," she said, embracing me with uncharacteristic warmth, "this has been the most beautiful wedding I've ever attended. So intimate and personal. You've created something truly special here." The words were exactly what I'd hoped to hear from her months earlier, but now they felt hollow and conditional. Her newfound appreciation had nothing to do with gaining a deeper understanding of our choices, and everything to do with Dave's presence validating decisions she'd previously dismissed. Still, I accepted her congratulations graciously, recognizing that her behavior revealed more about her character than mine. Robert's approach was even more transparent in its motivation. He congratulated Mike enthusiastically, while positioning himself for an introduction to Dave, clearly hoping to transition from wedding guest to political networking opportunity. His sudden interest in our celebration was so obviously mercenary that I felt embarrassed on his behalf, but Dave handled the interaction with practiced grace, engaging Robert in conversation about community development initiatives, while subtly deflecting attempts to schedule follow-up meetings. As the afternoon progressed into evening, and the reception portion of our celebration began, the string lights we'd hung created exactly the magical atmosphere we'd envisioned. The casual nature of our potluck reception allowed for organic conversations and natural mingling, with guests moving freely between different groups and activities, rather than being confined to assigned seating arrangements. Dave proved to be a master of working the room, but not in the calculating way I'd witnessed from other politicians at formal events. Instead, he moved through our gathering with genuine curiosity and interest, spending time with each group of guests and asking thoughtful questions about their lives and work. He seemed particularly drawn to my grandfather's stories about his career as a mechanic, and my grandmother's detailed descriptions of her garden, conversations that were unlikely to advance any political agenda, but clearly brought him joy. The moment that defined the entire afternoon came when Dave was asked to give an impromptu toast, as the sun began to set behind the trees in our backyard. He accepted a glass of champagne from Rachel and called for everyone's attention with the kind of natural authority that made it clear why he'd been successful in politics, despite his humble approach to personal interactions. What he said next would become the story I'd tell for the rest of my life, the moment that perfectly captured everything our wedding had been about, and everything his presence had revealed about the people in our lives. Dave raised his champagne glass as the gentle murmur of conversation gradually faded into expectant silence. The golden hour light filtered through the oak leaves above us, casting dancing shadows across the faces of our guests as they turned their attention to the man who had somehow transformed our simple backyard celebration into something extraordinary, simply by showing up as himself. "I need to tell you all a story," Dave began, his voice carrying that same warmth I remembered from our late-night study sessions, but now infused with the confidence that came from years of public speaking, about a 19-year-old college freshman who was absolutely terrified of her statistics class. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd as guests realized he was talking about me. I felt my cheeks flush, but I was smiling as memories of those difficult first-semester courses came flooding back. Jessica Parker sat in the front row every single class, taking notes so detailed they could have been published as textbooks. Dave continued, his eyes finding mine across the gathering. But every Thursday evening, she'd knock on our dorm room door with her statistics homework, and this look of pure panic on her face. Not because she wasn't smart enough to figure it out, but because she cared so much about getting it right. I remembered those study sessions vividly. Dave had been endlessly patient, explaining concepts in different ways until something clicked, never making me feel stupid for struggling with material that seemed to come naturally to him. Those evenings had forged a friendship based on mutual respect and genuine care, qualities that had clearly shaped both of our life choices in the years since. What struck me then, and what strikes me now, is that Jessica never took shortcuts, Dave said, his voice growing more serious. She never looked for the easy path, or the quick solution. She worked through problems methodically, honestly, with integrity. She approached her education the same way she approaches everything else in her life, with authenticity and determination. The guests were listening intently now, drawn in by Dave's storytelling ability and the obvious affection in his voice. Even Patricia had stopped fidgeting with her jewelry and was focused completely on his words. Fast forward 8 years, Dave continued, and I get a phone call from this same woman, telling me about her wedding plans. She describes this beautiful vision of celebrating her love in the place that means the most to her, surrounded by the people who have been part of her journey. She talks about string lights and wildflowers, about her grandmother's recipes and her father's careful attention to every detail. And I think to myself, this is exactly what I would expect from Jessica Parker. Something real, something honest, something that reflects who she actually is, rather than who other people think she should be. I felt tears welling up in my eyes as I realized where his speech was heading. Dave wasn't just offering a toast, he was providing a masterclass in the difference between authentic celebration and performative display. "I've been to a lot of weddings in my current position," Dave said, and I noticed several guests lean forward slightly, reminded once again of exactly who was speaking. Elaborate affairs in historic venues, ceremonies that cost more than most people's houses, receptions with guest lists that read like Fortune 500 directories. And you know what I remember most about those celebrations? The stress, the anxiety. The bride and groom, who were so worried about executing their Pinterest boards perfectly, that they forgot to actually enjoy the moment they were supposedly celebrating. A murmur of recognition moved through our guests, many of whom had undoubtedly attended similar events and felt that same sense of disconnect between intention and execution. But this, Dave gestured around our backyard with obvious appreciation, this is what celebration should look like. I see Jessica's third-grade teaching colleagues over there, sharing stories about the creative projects she develops for her students. I see Mike's firefighter friends, talking about the time he ran into a burning building to rescue a family's cat, because he understood that sometimes the smallest acts of service matter just as much as the big ones. I see grandparents who drove here in their 1987 Buick, because they wouldn't miss this moment for anything in the world. Grandpa Joe raised his champagne glass slightly in acknowledgement, and I saw him wipe his eyes with his free hand. This gathering represents something that's become increasingly rare in our society, Dave continued, his voice taking on the tone I recognized from his political speeches, but somehow more personal and intimate. Genuine community, people who show up for each other not because of what they might gain, but because of what they've already given and received. Relationships built on shared experiences and mutual respect, rather than mutual benefit. I caught sight of Robert Henderson's face, and saw that he was beginning to understand that Dave's words contained a subtle but pointed critique of exactly the kind of social climbing and networking behavior he'd been engaging in all afternoon. Jessica and Mike made a choice when they planned this wedding, Dave said, his eyes moving between us with obvious fondness. They chose to prioritize authenticity over appearance, meaning over expense, community over status. They chose to celebrate their love in a way that reflected their values, rather than other people's expectations. And in doing so, they've created something beautiful and meaningful that will be remembered not for what it cost, but for what it represented. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the gentle rustle of leaves in the evening breeze, and the distant sound of children playing in neighboring yards. I looked around at our guests, and saw expressions that ranged from thoughtful appreciation to obvious emotional impact. My mother was crying openly, and my father had his arm around her shoulders, both of them beaming with pride. So here's to Jessica and Mike, Dave concluded, raising his glass higher, for having the courage to build a marriage on the same foundation they've built this celebration: love, authenticity, and the unwavering belief that what matters most cannot be purchased, only earned through daily choices and genuine care for each other. The toast that erupted from our guests was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't the polite applause of a formal reception, but rather the enthusiastic response of people who had been genuinely moved by what they'd heard. Glasses clinked throughout the gathering as our friends and family drank to our marriage, and to the values Dave had so eloquently articulated. But it was the Henderson family's reaction that provided the afternoon's most revealing moment. Patricia stood frozen with her champagne glass halfway to her lips, her face a study in conflicted emotions, as she processed the implications of what Dave had just said. His words had been gracious and diplomatic, but the message was unmistakable. He was celebrating exactly the choices she had spent months criticizing and attempting to change. Robert looked equally uncomfortable, clearly recognizing that his behavior throughout the afternoon had placed him firmly in the category of people who valued networking over genuine relationship. His attempts to engage Dave in political conversations suddenly seemed transparent and calculating in light of the governor's obvious preference for authentic connection over professional advancement. Stephanie, meanwhile, appeared to be having some kind of existential crisis as she compared her own elaborate Tuscany wedding to the celebration she was currently attending. I could practically see her mental calculations as she tried to reconcile the obvious success and meaningfulness of our simple gathering with her assumptions about what constituted an appropriate celebration. The most powerful moment came when Dave stepped down from his informal speaking position and was immediately surrounded by guests who wanted to continue the conversation his toast had started. But instead of gravitating toward the Henderson family members who were clearly hoping for political access, he made his way directly to my grandparents. "Mrs. Parker," he said to my grandmother, "I'd love to hear more about that garden you were describing earlier. Jessica tells me you taught her everything she knows about growing flowers." Grandma Rose lit up like a Christmas tree, delighted to have someone express genuine interest in her passion project. She launched into a detailed description of her planting strategies and seasonal rotation schedule, while Dave listened with obvious fascination, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated he was actually paying attention rather than simply being polite. The contrast between Dave's authentic interest in my grandmother's gardening expertise and Robert's
transparent attempts at political networking couldn't have been more stark. Here was one of the most powerful people in our state, choosing to spend his time learning about soil composition and pest management strategies from an 80-year-old retired seamstress, while a wealthy businessman stood nearby, looking increasingly frustrated by his inability to command the governor's attention. As the evening progressed, the reception took on the relaxed, joyful atmosphere we'd envisioned when we first began planning our celebration. The potluck dinner was a resounding success, with guests moving freely between different food stations and praising everything from Mrs. Patterson's famous fried chicken to my cousin's homemade mac and cheese. The casual nature of the meal encouraged conversation and connection in ways that formal seating arrangements never could have achieved. Dave proved to be a master of working a room, but in the most genuine way possible. He spent time with my teaching colleagues, discussing education funding and policy initiatives with the kind of detailed knowledge that made it clear he actually understood the challenges they faced in their classrooms. He engaged Mike's firefighter friends in conversations about community safety programs, listening carefully to their suggestions and taking notes on his phone about ideas he wanted to research further. The moment that crystallized everything for me came when I spotted Dave sitting cross-legged on our back porch with Kevin, my 22-year-old brother who was finishing his senior year at Ohio University. They were deep in conversation about Kevin's environmental science thesis, and I could see Dave's genuine interest in the research Kevin was conducting on local water quality issues. "Your brother has some brilliant ideas about watershed management," Dave said when I joined them briefly. "I'd love to connect him with some folks at the EPA who are working on similar projects." Kevin's face was glowing with excitement and validation. Here was the governor of Ohio taking his undergraduate research seriously, treating his ideas with respect and offering to help advance his academic and professional goals. It was exactly the kind of mentoring and encouragement that Dave had provided during our college years, now extended to the next generation of students and activists. The dancing portion of our reception began as the sun set completely and our string lights took on their full magical effect. Mike's friend Brad, who played guitar in a local band, had set up a small sound system and was providing live music that perfectly matched the intimate atmosphere we'd created. The first dance Mike and I shared as a married couple took place on the makeshift dance floor my father had created by laying down sheets of plywood, surrounded by friends and family who cheered and sang along to the acoustic version of At Last that Brad had learned specifically for our wedding. Dave proved to be an excellent dancer, graciously accepting invitations from several of the older women in attendance and charming them all with his easy conversation and obvious enjoyment of the music. I watched him dance with my grandmother and saw her face light up with delight as he complimented her on her grace and asked her about the dance classes she'd taken as a young woman. The Henderson family, meanwhile, seemed to be struggling with how to position themselves in this new social dynamic. Patricia had clearly realized that her initial assessment of our wedding had been not just wrong but embarrassingly so, and she was now attempting to demonstrate her appreciation for exactly the elements she'd previously criticized. Her compliments about our decorations and food choices felt forced and overcompensated, like someone trying to correct a mistake after the damage had already been done. Robert continued his attempts to engage Dave in political conversations, but his efforts were increasingly transparent and unsuccessful. Dave politely deflected each attempt at networking while continuing to focus his attention on the people who were simply enjoying the celebration without ulterior motives.
The most uncomfortable moment came when Stephanie approached me during a brief break in the dancing, clearly struggling with something she wanted to say but wasn't sure how to articulate. "Jessica," she began hesitantly, "I owe you an apology. I've been thinking about what Governor Williams said in his toast, and I realize that I haven't been very supportive of your choices. I was so focused on comparing this to my own wedding that I missed the point entirely." Her words seemed genuine, though I could sense the effort it was taking for her to admit she'd been wrong. Stephanie had built her identity around having the perfect wedding, the kind that got featured in magazines and generated social media envy. Acknowledging that our simple backyard celebration might be more meaningful than her elaborate Italian destination wedding required a significant shift in perspective. "I appreciate that," I said carefully, not wanting to be ungenerous, but also not ready to pretend that her months of criticism and condescension could be erased by a single conversation. "This day has been everything Mike and I hoped it would be." "It really has been beautiful," she said, and for the first time her compliment felt authentic rather than performative. "I can see why Governor Williams was so enthusiastic about being part of it. You've created something really special here." The conversation was interrupted by a burst of laughter from the group gathered around Dave, who was apparently in the middle of telling a story about his early days in politics. I excused myself to rejoin the celebration, but I noticed that Stephanie remained standing where I'd left her, watching our guests with a thoughtful expression that suggested she was reevaluating some of her fundamental assumptions about what made celebrations meaningful. As the evening wore on, I found myself moving through our gathering with a sense of deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with vindication or proving anyone wrong. This was simply the celebration we'd always wanted to have: intimate, authentic, filled with genuine joy and connection. The fact that Dave's presence had forced certain people to recognize the value of what we'd created was gratifying, but it wasn't the source of my happiness. The real gift was watching our communities come together in ways that transcended professional and social boundaries. I saw my third-grade teaching partner deep in conversation with one of Mike's firefighter colleagues about their shared experiences working in public service. I watched Dave help my grandfather carry folding chairs back to the church van, the two of them discussing the governor's plans for rural infrastructure development with obvious mutual respect. The magic of the evening reached its peak during the last hour of our reception, when Brad switched from background music to more participatory songs that got everyone singing along. Dave proved to have a surprisingly good voice, harmonizing with the crowd on classic songs that spanned generations and brought together guests who might never have found common ground in any other setting. The Henderson family's transformation was complete by this point. Patricia was chatting animatedly with my mother about recipes and gardening tips, having apparently decided that if the governor found our family interesting, then perhaps there was more to us than she'd initially recognized. Robert had finally abandoned his networking attempts and was instead engaged in what appeared to be a genuine conversation with my father about home improvement projects and local contractors. The moment that will stay with me forever came near the end of the evening, when Dave pulled Mike and me aside for a private conversation away from the main gathering. "I want you both to know how honored I am to have been part of this celebration," he said, his voice carrying the same sincerity that had characterized his entire approach to our wedding. "This is exactly what I needed to remember about why I got into politics in the first place. It's about serving communities like this one, supporting people who are building meaningful lives based on authentic values." "Thank you for being here," Mike replied, clearly moved by Dave's words. "Your speech, your presence, everything about today has been more meaningful than we could have imagined." "The funny thing is," Dave continued with a slight smile, "I think your family members are going to be talking about this wedding for years to come, but probably not for the reasons they expected." He was right, of course. The Henderson family had arrived expecting to endure an embarrassing afternoon that would reinforce their assumptions about appropriate celebrations and social expectations. Instead, they were leaving with a completely different understanding of what made gatherings meaningful and what kinds of people deserved respect and admiration. As our guests began to say their goodbyes and help with cleanup, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this moment. The months of criticism and pressure from Mike's family had been difficult, but they had also forced us to become clearer about our own values and more confident in our choices. Dave's departure was characteristically low-key, with handshakes and hugs for our family members and promises to stay in touch that felt genuine rather than obligatory. His security team had maintained their discreet presence throughout the evening, allowing him to enjoy the celebration like any other guest while ensuring his safety and managing the few curious neighbors who had noticed the official vehicles parked on our street. "Call me next week," Dave said as he prepared to leave. I meant what I said to Kevin about connecting him with EPA contacts, and I'd love to hear how your school year starts off. As his sedan pulled away from our back gate, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: pride in what we'd accomplished, gratitude for Dave's friendship and support, satisfaction at having stayed true to our values despite external pressure, and excitement about beginning our married life with such a clear sense of who we were and what mattered to us. The cleanup process became its own celebration as our remaining guests worked together to restore our backyard to its normal state. The borrowed chairs were folded and loaded into vehicles, the decorations were carefully packed away for potential future use, and the leftover food was distributed among helpers who had made the entire day possible. Patricia Henderson surprised me by staying until the very end, working alongside my mother to clean serving dishes and pack away centerpieces with an attention to detail that suggested genuine investment rather than obligatory politeness. Her transformation throughout the day had been remarkable to witness, and while I remained somewhat skeptical about its permanence, I was willing to give her credit for recognizing when she'd been wrong and making an effort to correct course. As Mike and I finally found ourselves alone in our transformed backyard, now returned to its everyday appearance but somehow forever changed by the celebration it had hosted, I felt a deep sense of completion and beginning simultaneously. "So," Mike said, pulling me close in the space where we'd exchanged vows just hours earlier, "was it everything you hoped it would be?" "It was better," I replied honestly. "It was exactly what we wanted, plus things we never could have imagined." The truth was that Dave's presence and speech had elevated our celebration in ways that went far beyond simple validation or social status. He had articulated the values and choices that had shaped our wedding in language that helped everyone understand what we'd been trying to achieve. His words had served as a bridge between different worldviews, helping people who might never have appreciated our choices to see them in a new light. But more importantly, his genuine enjoyment of our celebration had reinforced our own confidence in the decisions we'd made. We hadn't needed the governor of Ohio to validate our choices, but having someone we respected recognize and celebrate our authenticity had been a gift we'd carry with us into our marriage and beyond. The weeks following our wedding brought changes that rippled through both of our families in ways we never could have anticipated. The most immediate shift came from Patricia Henderson, who called me 3 days after the ceremony to invite my mother and me to lunch at her country club. The same woman who had spent months questioning our judgment and criticizing our choices was now eager to introduce us to her social circle, apparently having decided that anyone close enough to the governor to serve as his best man deserved immediate elevation in her estimation. "I've been thinking about what Governor Williams said during his speech," Patricia told me over salmon salads in the club's elegant dining room, her voice carrying a tone of reflection I'd never heard from her before. "About authenticity and genuine community. I realize I may have been focusing on the wrong things when it came to your wedding plans." The conversation was surreal in its reversal of everything that had transpired during our engagement period. Patricia spoke with newfound respect about our choices, praising the very elements she'd previously dismissed as inadequate or inappropriate. The string lights she'd once deemed too casual were now enchantingly atmospheric. The potluck reception she'd criticized as unprofessional had become refreshingly inclusive and community-oriented. My mother, to her credit, accepted Patricia's overtures graciously while maintaining a certain diplomatic reserve that suggested she hadn't forgotten the months of condescension we'd endured. Linda Parker had raised me to believe in second chances and the possibility of growth, but she was also practical enough to recognize performative behavior when she saw it. "I'm glad the wedding exceeded your expectations," my mother replied diplomatically, cutting her salad with precise movements that somehow conveyed both politeness and caution. "Jessica and Mike worked very hard to create something meaningful. The lunch conversation revealed the extent to which Dave's presence and speech had forced Patricia to reevaluate not just our wedding choices but her entire framework for assessing worth and significance. She'd built her social identity around exclusive venues, expensive celebrations, and connections to influential people, but Dave's obvious preference for authentic relationships over networking opportunities had challenged those assumptions in ways she was still processing. I keep thinking about how comfortable Governor Williams seemed at your reception, Patricia continued, clearly struggling with concepts that didn't fit her usual worldview. He spent most of the evening talking with your grandparents and that young teacher from your school. I would have expected him to seek out different kinds of conversations. What Patricia was discovering, though she couldn't quite articulate it, was that Dave's behavior reflected a set of values that prioritized genuine connection over strategic advantage. His choice to spend time with people based on their character rather than their influence was foreign to someone who had spent decades navigating social situations with careful attention to hierarchy and potential benefit. The transformation extended beyond individual conversations to concrete actions that demonstrated a fundamental shift in Patricia's approach to our relationship. She began calling regularly to check on how we were settling into married life, offering assistance with everything from home decorating advice to recommendations for contractors and service providers. Her offers of help felt different from the controlling behavior we'd experienced during wedding planning, more like genuine attempts to build bridges than efforts to impose her preferences. Mike noticed the change immediately, though he remained somewhat skeptical about its permanence. "She's being nice," he told me after Patricia had spent an entire phone call asking about our honeymoon plans without once suggesting we should have chosen a different destination or extended our trip length. "I'm not complaining, but it's weird after months of criticism and suggestions." The honeymoon itself had been a perfect continuation of the themes that had defined our wedding celebration. We'd chosen a small cabin in Hocking Hills, about 2 hours south of Springdale, where we could hike during the day and sit on the porch in the evening watching fireflies emerge in the twilight. It was exactly the kind of simple, meaningful experience we'd wanted to share, and returning home to find Patricia's genuine interest in our adventures rather than judgment about our choices felt like validation of decisions we'd made based on our own preferences rather than external expectations. Robert Henderson's evolution was perhaps even more dramatic than his wife's, though it took a different form. Rather than attempting to recreate the social dynamics that had failed so spectacularly at our wedding, he began approaching Mike and me with questions about community involvement and volunteer opportunities. His interest seemed genuine, sparked by conversations at our reception about Mike's work with the fire department and my involvement in local education initiatives. "I've been thinking about Governor Williams' comments regarding community service," Robert told us during a dinner at their house several weeks after our wedding. "I realize I've been so focused on business growth and professional networking that I've lost touch with the kind of community engagement you two represent." His words carried the ring of authentic self-reflection rather than calculated positioning, suggesting that Dave's speech had prompted some serious examination of priorities and values. Robert began volunteering with a local financial literacy program, offering his expertise to help families navigate budgeting and investment decisions. The work seemed to energize him in ways his usual business activities never had, giving him a sense of purpose that extended beyond personal financial gain. Stephanie's response to our wedding was perhaps the most complex and interesting of all the family transformations. She'd spent years defining herself through her elaborate destination wedding and the social media attention it had generated, but Dave's speech about authenticity versus performance had clearly forced her to reconsider what made celebrations meaningful. "I keep looking at my wedding photos," she confided during a rare moment of vulnerability, "and I realize I can barely remember the actual day. I was so stressed about executing everything perfectly that I never relaxed enough to enjoy what was happening." Her admission opened up conversations about the pressure she'd felt to create an Instagram-worthy celebration that would generate envy and admiration from her social circle. The time and energy she'd invested in coordinating every detail with military precision had left little room for the spontaneous joy and genuine connection that had characterized our backyard reception. "Your wedding felt like a celebration," Stephanie continued, her voice carrying a wistfulness that suggested she was mourning something she'd lost without realizing it at the time. Mine felt like a performance, beautiful but somehow empty. These family conversations were taking place against a backdrop of community response that had been equally surprising in its depth and reach. Word had spread quickly through Springdale about the governor's attendance at our wedding, but rather than focusing on the political significance of his presence, people seemed more interested in the values his speech had articulated and the way our celebration had embodied those principles. My principal at Springdale Elementary approached me during our preschool meetings in late August with an unexpected proposition. "I've been hearing wonderful things about your wedding," she said, particularly about Governor Williams' remarks about community and authentic celebration. "Would you be interested in helping us plan some school events that reflect those same values?" The conversation led to my involvement in redesigning our school's approach to parent engagement and community building. Instead of formal fundraising galas that required significant financial contributions, we began organizing potluck gatherings and volunteer workdays that allowed families to contribute their time and skills rather than just their checkbooks. The shift in approach resulted in higher participation rates and stronger relationships between families, teachers, and students. Mike experienced similar ripple effects in his professional environment. His fire department colleagues had been impressed by the genuine warmth and interest Dave had shown in their work during our reception, and several of them had been inspired to become more involved in local politics and community organizing. The station began hosting regular community safety workshops and neighborhood engagement events that strengthened relationships between first responders and the residents they served. Dave himself proved to be as genuine in his follow-through as he had been in his wedding toast. He called regularly to check on how we were adjusting to married life, and he made good on his promise to connect Kevin with EPA contacts who could help advance his environmental research. More significantly, he began incorporating themes from his wedding speech into his public addresses, talking about the importance of authentic community engagement and the difference between meaningful service and performative politics. "That wedding reminded me why I got into public service in the first place," Dave told me during one of our phone conversations. "It wasn't about power or influence, it was about supporting communities where people take care of each other because it's the right thing to do, not because of what they might gain from it." His words reflected a perspective that seemed to be gaining traction in his administration's policy priorities. Dave began championing initiatives that supported grassroots community organizations and local volunteer efforts, recognizing that sustainable change often emerged from authentic relationships and shared values rather than top-down mandates or expensive programs. The most unexpected consequence of our wedding celebration emerged several months later when Patricia Henderson approached me with a proposal that initially seemed impossible to believe. She wanted to help other families plan meaningful, authentic celebrations that prioritized community and connection over expense and status. "I've been talking with friends at the country club," she explained during a coffee meeting that would have been unimaginable just months earlier, "and I keep hearing the same stories. Daughters who are stressed about wedding planning, families going into debt for celebrations that feel more like obligations than joy, young couples who are so focused on creating the perfect event that they're losing sight of what they're actually celebrating." Patricia's idea was to create a consulting service that would help families design celebrations based on their values and relationships rather than social expectations or competitive spending. She wanted to share what she'd learned from observing our wedding about the difference between meaningful gatherings and expensive performances. "I realize this might sound strange coming from me," she continued, "but I think I could help other families avoid the mistakes I made in trying to impose my vision on your celebration. I've learned that authenticity can't be purchased or planned from the outside, it has to emerge from genuine understanding of what matters to the people actually getting married." The irony of Patricia Henderson becoming an advocate for budget-conscious, community-focused celebrations was not lost on anyone who had witnessed her behavior during our engagement period. But her transformation seemed genuine, rooted in real recognition of what she'd nearly missed by focusing on surface appearances rather than deeper values. Mike and I agreed to serve as references for her new venture, sharing our experience and insights with couples who were struggling with similar family pressures and social expectations. The work proved deeply satisfying, allowing us to help other people navigate the same challenges we'd faced while building confidence in choices that reflected their authentic selves rather than external demands.
The consulting service became surprisingly successful, attracting clients who were drawn to Patricia's inside knowledge of high society expectations combined with her newfound understanding of what actually made celebrations meaningful. Her background gave her credibility with families who might otherwise dismiss advice about budget-conscious planning, while her conversion experience provided authentic insight into the limitations of status-focused approaches. One of the most rewarding aspects of this work was watching Patricia continue to evolve in her understanding of community and relationship. Working with diverse families forced her to expand her definition of success and significance, exposing her to value systems and life choices that differed dramatically from her previous social circle's narrow focus on wealth and status. "Every family I work with teaches me something new about what matters," Patricia told me during one of our regular check-ins about the consulting business. "I used to think there was only one way to do things properly, but now I see that the best celebrations are the ones that most authentically represent the people planning them." Her words reflected a transformation that extended far beyond wedding planning into fundamental changes in how she approached relationships and community involvement. Patricia began volunteering with local organizations, offering her business skills to help nonprofits improve their fundraising and event planning capabilities. The work connected her to aspects of community life she'd never previously encountered, broadening her perspective on what kinds of contributions created genuine value. Kevin's environmental research, meanwhile, had flourished under the mentorship connections Dave had facilitated. His undergraduate thesis on local watershed management had evolved into a graduate research project that was attracting attention from policymakers and environmental organizations throughout the region. The confidence he'd gained from having his work taken seriously by the governor had motivated him to pursue more ambitious goals and seek out opportunities that might contribute to meaningful environmental progress. "I keep thinking about what Governor Williams said at your wedding about choosing authenticity over expectation," Kevin told me during a family dinner several months later. "That's exactly what I needed to hear about my own career path. I was worried that environmental science wasn't prestigious enough, but now I realize that working on issues I actually care about is more important than impressing people with my job title." His research was beginning to influence local policy decisions, with several municipalities implementing water quality monitoring programs based on his recommendations. The work
provided concrete evidence that meaningful change could emerge from authentic commitment to community welfare rather than abstract political maneuvering or professional advancement. The ripple effects of our wedding celebration continued to expand in ways that reminded us daily of the power of authentic choices and genuine community connection. Teachers at my school began organizing more inclusive family events that welcomed participation regardless of financial resources. Mike's Fire Station started hosting regular community gatherings that brought together residents from different neighborhoods and social backgrounds. Dave's administration continued prioritizing grassroots community support over top-down policy initiatives. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was the shift in our own relationship with Mike's extended family. The months following our wedding brought a gradual healing of tensions that had seemed insurmountable during our engagement period. Patricia's transformation from critic to advocate created space for more honest conversations about values, priorities, and what it meant to build meaningful lives. "I owe you both an apology," Robert said during our first anniversary dinner, his voice carrying a sincerity that would have been impossible to imagine a year earlier. "I spent so much time focused on appearances and social positioning that I nearly missed the opportunity to really know you as people rather than just as extensions of our family reputation." His words represented acknowledgement of behavior that had been hurtful and dismissive, but also genuine commitment to building different kinds of relationships moving forward. The year had brought regular family dinners where conversations focused on work satisfaction and community involvement rather than financial achievements and social status. The shift created opportunities for connection that had been impossible when interactions were filtered through judgment and hierarchical positioning. Stephanie's evolution was equally remarkable, though it took longer to fully manifest. She'd begun questioning not just her wedding choices but her entire approach to social relationships and personal fulfillment.
The realization that her destination celebration had prioritized performance over meaning led to broader examination of whether she was building a life that reflected her authentic values or simply met external expectations. "I want my kids to see marriage and celebration modeled the way you two did it," she told us during a family gathering as our second anniversary approached. Based on genuine connection and shared values rather than financial competition and social positioning, her words represented recognition that the lessons of our wedding extended far beyond event planning into fundamental questions about how to build relationships and communities that sustained meaningful growth rather than superficial achievement. As Mike and I reflected on the 2 years that had passed since our backyard celebration, we marveled at the unexpected ways our simple decision to prioritize authenticity over appearance had influenced not just our own lives but the relationships and choices of people throughout our extended community. Dave's speech had articulated values that resonated far beyond our specific situation, inspiring examinations of priorities and commitments that led to more meaningful engagement with family, work, and community responsibility. The lesson we'd learned wasn't that having the governor at your wedding guaranteed social transformation or family reconciliation. Rather, it was that choosing authenticity over expectation created space for genuine connection and growth that wouldn't have been possible if we'd prioritized other people's approval over our own values. Our marriage had been strengthened by beginning with such clear understanding of what mattered most to us, and the relationships that had grown from that foundation continued to provide the kind of support and joy that couldn't be purchased or performed. Only earned through daily choices to show up authentically for each other and our community. The real magic hadn't been that a governor took the microphone at our wedding, it was that we'd created a celebration honest enough to deserve his words, and a community strong enough to be transformed by them. 5 years had passed since that golden afternoon in my parents' backyard, and the anniversary of our wedding had become an annual celebration that drew together an ever-expanding circle of friends, family, and community members who had been touched by the story of our unconventional beginning. What started as a simple dinner party had evolved into something much larger, a gathering that embodied the same principles of authenticity and inclusion that had defined our original ceremony. The event had outgrown our backyard, necessitating a move to the community center at Springdale Elementary, where the gymnasium was transformed each May with the same string lights and wildflower arrangements that had decorated our wedding reception. The location felt perfect, connecting our celebration to the work that continued to define both of our careers and the community involvement that had shaped our marriage. Mike had been promoted to fire captain 2 years earlier, a recognition of not just his professional skills but his leadership in community engagement initiatives that had strengthened relationships between the department and the neighborhoods they served. His approach to public safety emphasized prevention and connection rather than just emergency response, creating programs that brought residents and first responders together in ways that built trust and mutual understanding. My own career had taken an unexpected turn when I was selected to serve as Springdale's Community Liaison Coordinator, a newly created position that connected the school district with local organizations, businesses, and government agencies. The role allowed me to apply the relationship-building skills I'd developed as a teacher to larger questions of how institutions could better serve the diverse needs of our growing community. The work was deeply satisfying, particularly when it involved helping other organizations adopt the inclusive, authentic approaches that had proven so successful in our own experience. I found myself consulting with nonprofits, community groups, and even other school districts about how to design programs and events that prioritize genuine engagement over performative displays of involvement. Dave had been re-elected for a second term as governor with an even larger margin of victory than his initial campaign, having built a reputation for policy approaches that emphasized grassroots support and community-based solutions rather than top-down mandates. His administration continued to reference themes from our wedding speech in public communications, talking about the importance of authentic leadership and the difference between serving constituents and managing them. His continued friendship with our family had been one of the unexpected gifts of our wedding day. Dave made it a point to attend our anniversary celebrations whenever his schedule allowed, and he'd become something of a mentor to Kevin,
who was now completing his doctoral dissertation on sustainable water management policies with support from EPA researchers Dave had connected him with years earlier. "Every time I'm here," Dave said during our 4th anniversary celebration, looking around the transformed gymnasium at the diverse crowd of teachers, firefighters, business owners, retirees, and young families who had gathered to mark another year of our marriage, I'm reminded of why that wedding speech was so easy to write. You two created something that naturally draws authentic people together, and that energy just keeps expanding." His words captured something I'd been struggling to articulate about the way our marriage had continued to serve as a catalyst for community connection and positive change. We hadn't set out to become symbols of anything larger than our own relationship, but the principles we'd embodied in planning our wedding had apparently resonated with people who were hungry for examples of how to build meaningful lives and genuine communities. Patricia Henderson had become one of the most unlikely champions of these principles, having expanded her celebration consulting business into a full-scale event planning company that specialized in what she called values-based gatherings. Her client base had grown to include corporate retreats, nonprofit fundraisers, and community celebrations throughout Central Ohio, all designed around the core insight she'd gained from witnessing our wedding. "I used to think my job was to impress people," Patricia explained during a presentation she gave at our anniversary celebration about her business transformation. "Now I understand that my role is to help people express what already matters to them, just more clearly and beautifully than they might manage on their own." Her company had become a case study in authentic business practices, with employees who were chosen for their commitment to the values Patricia espoused rather than just their technical skills or industry connections. The workplace culture she'd created emphasized collaboration over competition, meaningful work over financial achievement, and long-term relationship building over short-term profit maximization. Robert's journey had been equally transformative, though it had taken him in directions none of us could have predicted. His volunteer work with financial literacy programs had evolved into a second career focused on helping working families navigate economic challenges and build sustainable financial security. He'd eventually left his investment firm to establish a nonprofit organization that provided free financial counseling and education to low-income communities throughout the region. "That wedding taught me the difference between being wealthy and being valuable," Robert said during one of our regular family dinners. "I spent decades accumulating money and status, but I never felt as satisfied as I do now helping families achieve stability and independence." His transformation had required significant lifestyle adjustments, including selling the Westwood Hills mansion and moving to a more modest home in a neighborhood where he could walk to work and know his neighbors by name. The change had initially been difficult for Patricia, who had built her identity around the social status that came with their previous address, but she'd come to appreciate the authenticity and community connection their new living situation provided. Stephanie's evolution had been perhaps the most dramatic of all, involving not just changes in perspective but concrete actions that demonstrated genuine commitment to different values. She'd divorced her corporate lawyer husband after realizing their relationship was built more on mutual advancement than genuine affection, and she'd relocated to a smaller city where she could afford to work for a legal aid organization that served domestic violence survivors. "I kept looking at Jessica and Mike's marriage and seeing something I'd never experienced," Stephanie confided during a rare visit back to Springdale. "They actually liked each other. They chose to spend time together because they enjoyed each other's company, not because it advanced their careers or impressed their social circles." Her new life was challenging in ways her previous existence had never been, requiring long hours, modest pay, and emotional investment in clients whose problems couldn't be solved with money or social connections. But she spoke about her work with a passion and sense of purpose that had been completely absent from her previous corporate position. "I'm finally doing something that matters," she said, her voice carrying a conviction that reminded me of the values Dave had articulated in his wedding speech. "Something that uses my skills to help people build better lives rather than just generating billable hours for wealthy clients." Kevin had become something of a local celebrity for his environmental research, with his dissertation work influencing water quality policies throughout Ohio and attracting national attention from environmental organizations and policy think tanks. His success provided a powerful example of how authentic commitment to meaningful work could create opportunities for influence and impact that were impossible to achieve through networking or political maneuvering alone. I keep thinking about what you taught me about staying true to your values even when other people don't understand them, Kevin said during our 5th anniversary celebration, addressing the crowd with the confidence that had grown from years of having his work taken seriously by people whose opinions mattered. That lesson has shaped everything I've done since graduation. His research had begun influencing policy at the state level, with Dave's administration implementing several of Kevin's recommendations for watershed protection and sustainable development practices. The work demonstrated how authentic expertise and genuine commitment to community welfare could create pathways for meaningful change that bypassed traditional political processes and power structures. The anniversary celebrations themselves had evolved into something quite remarkable, drawing attendees who came not just to honor our marriage but to participate in what had become an annual community gathering focused on sharing stories about authentic living and meaningful work. People used the occasion to announce new projects, celebrate achievements, and connect with others who shared similar values and commitments. The event had attracted attention from beyond our immediate community, with visitors coming from other towns and cities who had heard about the unique atmosphere and inclusive approach that characterized our celebrations. Some came as observers, curious about how a simple wedding anniversary had become a model for community engagement and authentic celebration. Others came as participants, eager to connect with a network of people who prioritized relationships and values over status and achievement. "This feels like what community used to mean," said Margaret Watson, a retiree who had started attending our celebrations after moving to Springdale from Cleveland. People gathering because they genuinely care about each other, not because they're obligated to maintain social connections or professional networks. Her observation captured something essential about what our anniversary celebrations had become. Unlike many community events that were designed around specific demographics or interest groups, our gathering naturally attracted people from diverse backgrounds who were united by shared values rather than similar circumstances. The diversity of attendees was remarkable, including everyone from retired teachers and young families to local business owners, college students, and state government officials who made the drive from Columbus specifically to participate in our annual tradition. The common thread connecting all these different people was their commitment to building authentic relationships and contributing meaningfully to their communities. Dave's presence at these celebrations had become less remarkable over the years, not because people had grown accustomed to socializing with the governor, but because the values he represented had become so central to the culture of our gathering that his political position seemed secondary to his role as a friend and community member who embodied the principles we were all trying to live by. "The best part about these celebrations," Dave said during his informal remarks at our 5th anniversary event, "is that they remind me what good leadership actually looks like. Not the kind that comes from position or authority, but the kind that emerges when people commit to supporting each other's authentic growth and contribution." His words reflected insights that had continued to shape his approach to governing, emphasizing collaborative problem-solving and community-based solutions over political maneuvering and partisan positioning. His administration had become known for policy initiatives that emerged from genuine consultation with affected communities rather than abstract ideological commitments or interest group pressures. The ripple effects of our wedding celebration had continued expanding in ways that none of us could have anticipated, influencing not just individual relationships and career choices, but institutional approaches to community engagement and organizational culture. The story had been shared in various forums, from Patricia's business presentations to Kevin's academic conferences to Dave's policy speeches, always emphasizing the core insight about the power of authentic choices to create positive change. Several other couples had adopted similar approaches to their own wedding planning, prioritizing meaningful celebration over expensive display, and finding that the results exceeded their expectations in ways that paralleled our own experience. These weddings had become part of a broader movement toward authentic celebration and community-focused events that emphasized relationship building over status demonstration. Local businesses had begun incorporating similar principles into their operations, focusing on genuine service and community contribution rather than just profit maximization. The approach had proven surprisingly effective from a purely business perspective, generating customer loyalty and employee satisfaction that translated into sustainable growth and positive reputation. The elementary school where I'd taught for so many years had become a model for inclusive family engagement, with programs and events that welcomed participation from families regardless of their financial resources or social background. The approach had improved student outcomes while strengthening relationships between the school and the broader community it served. Mike's fire department had expanded their community engagement initiatives to include regular neighborhood meetings, safety education programs, and volunteer coordination efforts that strengthened relationships between residents and first responders while improving overall community resilience and preparedness. As I stood in the decorated gymnasium during our 5th anniversary celebration, surrounded by friends, family, and community members whose lives had been touched in various ways by the story of our wedding, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this moment. The decision to prioritize authenticity over appearance, community over status, and meaningful celebration over expensive display had created opportunities for connection and growth that continued expanding in directions we never could have imagined. The lesson wasn't that having the governor at your wedding guaranteed a happily ever after, or that choosing authentic celebration automatically solved all relationship challenges. Rather, it was that making decisions based on your genuine values created space for the kind of relationships and opportunities that sustained long-term happiness and meaningful contribution. Mike and I had built our marriage on the same foundation that had shaped our wedding planning: honest communication, shared values, and commitment to supporting each other's authentic growth and development. The approach had served us well through the normal challenges and changes that every marriage faces, providing a solid base for navigating everything from career transitions to family health scares to the ordinary stresses of daily life. Our relationship had been strengthened by beginning with such clarity about what mattered most to us, and by continuing to prioritize those values even when external pressures suggested different approaches might be easier or more profitable. The consistency between our private choices and public commitments had created trust and stability that allowed us to take risks and pursue opportunities that might have seemed too challenging or uncertain from a less secure foundation. The community that had grown around our story continued to provide support, encouragement, and accountability that enriched our lives while contributing to positive change in countless other relationships and situations. The network of friendships and professional connections that had emerged from our wedding celebration had become a source of ongoing inspiration and practical assistance that extended far beyond what we could have achieved individually. As the evening wound down and guests began sharing final conversations and making plans for future connections, I reflected on how the simple decision to invite Dave to be Mike's best man had catalyzed changes that were still unfolding 5 years later. The transformation hadn't happened because of his political position or social influence, but because his presence had created an opportunity for people to see authentic celebration modeled in ways that challenged their assumptions about what made gatherings meaningful. The real magic had been in creating a celebration worthy of his words, and a community strong enough to be transformed by the values those words articulated. The governor taking the microphone had been memorable, but the lasting impact had come from the choices we'd made long before that moment, choices that reflected our commitment to building relationships and communities based on genuine care rather than strategic advantage. Looking ahead to future anniversaries and the continued evolution of the relationships and initiatives that had grown from our wedding story, I felt excited about possibilities that remained to be discovered and grateful for the unexpected ways that authentic choices continued creating opportunities for positive change and meaningful connection. The journey had taught us that when you choose authenticity over expectation and community over status, you don't just get the celebration you want. You get the life you deserve, surrounded by people who see and support your genuine self, engaged in work that reflects your deepest values, contributing to changes that make the world a little more authentic and connected for everyone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.